Ja, liebe Annette Klasing, liebe Frau Professor Birkenbach, meine Damen und Herren, lieber Henning Scherf, Henning, das ist so schön. Bei jeder Veranstaltung sehe ich dich. Es gibt praktisch keine, wo wir uns nicht sehen. Das ist sehr schön. Ja, ich sehe viele bekannte Gesichter, aber auch etliche Unbekannte und das freut mich. Ich begrüße Sie alle ganz herzlich zu dieser
I
Veranstaltung
greet you very warmly to this event in our upper hall on the occasion of the International Peace Day of the United Nations. And unfortunately, I can say it's a very relevant day, a most significant day, which seeks to strengthen peace between people and countries, which is very positive. And it's also supposed to be a day of truce, of ceasefire and non-violence, where questions can be dealt with of that kind. And we can say that that is a hope. It's not a description of the present situation, unfortunately. But nevertheless, precisely at the moment, this day is so important more than ever because, as we know, so many wars and conflicts lead to destruction, poverty, hunger, and need, distress, displacement, and migration, forced migration. It would take too long to list the present conflicts. It's a long list. There are conflicts going on all over the world, and many of them are extremely present in our awareness because if they relate to Europe, but if they don't, we often don't because we're often Eurocentric. But of course, we all know that on the 24th of February 2022, war came back in the most flagrant way to Europe when Russia undertook its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And since then, millions have been fleeing. Over 5 million people have found refuge within the country, but over 8 million, just imagine, over 8 million Ukrainians have had to leave their country and now live as refugees in other European states, including in Germany and in Bremen. Many thousands of people have found refuge in Bremen, and I have to say that the readiness of the population to help has been proverbial, most impressive. That concerns both hands-on assistance here in terms of material goods, but also the willing to give money and to assist the people who've remained in Ukraine. Bremen is a very outward-looking city based on solidarity, and in this situation, that's been shown yet again, and that's very good. It's only the right thing for us to celebrate International Peace Day and meet here today. Peace and war, at least in the external sense, are a matter for nation states. And the question as to whether war is raging or peace is prevailing, these are questions which governments are prime movers in deciding. Sometimes there are alliances, but rarely is this decided at the level of cities and towns. But nevertheless, it's precisely the local work, urban diplomacy, which can be very helpful here. It is the core of all peace policy, and precisely at our present time, it's more important than ever, probably, where there is nationalistic rigidity, where at the level of nation states, instead of speaking the language of peace, they use the language of war as being the only possibility. That is the opportunity to lay the foundations of peace at the local level. Peace can be planted as a tender plant, in fact, for future growth. And in many cities, of course, it's been considered as primarily a question of foreign policy, but in many cities, it's been possible to create links which are impossible at the top level, the national level. And precisely Bremen has gathered a lot of experience in that, not in an open war, but I'm thinking of the Cold War. It was in 1976 that the first twinning with the city of Danzig, the Gdansk, was launched, which led to greater détente, in fact, created the basis for the rapprochement that led to the end of the Cold War, and many connections. Our city, twin city of Odessa, is, of course, also one which allows us to make our contribution. And it's a rapprochement, getting closer to the reality of the people in Ukraine. And through the extension of our partnership, it might be possible to help them to improve their infrastructure and to give assistance so that after the war has finished, they can have a kind of sensible, reasonable level of peace. And using our partnerships in the way we can at the moment, Izmir is another one, and we have relations to many, many other party cities. Haifa in Israel, for example, these are cities and relationships based on the idea that cities can get together and enhance peaceful coexistence of human beings. And there, the exchange of delegations is very helpful. There, the discussion in the city council or in the town itself is very helpful. And that way, we get an immediate perspective on the situation from the other side. We can't do everything, of course, but it's our obligation in Bremen. And Henning Scherf, whom we recall with such affection, stood for that, for this international approach of the city of Bremen, that we look over our fence and say, we're responsible for world peace in our own small way, at least for the people living here. That's part of it. And so for that reason, it's an honor for me and perfectly clear that, like my predecessor, I am also a member of Mayors for Peace, a network that has existed since 1984, and we've hung out the flag of that with great pride to say that we stand for a world that is peaceful, a world of disarmament, particularly respecting nuclear weapons, but others as well. And known for peace, the struggle for peace is a never-ending task, unfortunately. And today we're going to have a discussion about conflicts which weigh upon us in the world and have done so for a long time, a conflict with no simple solution. But precisely when there's no simple solution, is it more important to discuss the matter and to wrestle for a solution in the long run. So on this note, I'd like to thank the organizers, in particular the foundation, Die Schwelle, which is the main mover here, for organizing today's program. And I hope that we have a very informative session. Many thanks.
Willkommen.
So welcome to you, Annette Carding. I'm giving the official welcome. That is, the chair is actually not quite there at the moment. We're supposed to have a look at a clip which will be with the partner organizations who have prepared this short video so that they can say what's important to them about this Peace Day and how they have such warm wishes for peace in the world.
Herzlichen Glückwunsch zum Weltfriedenstag. Ich bin Susanne Korhammer, Mitglied des Kuratoriums der Schwelle. Wir unterstützen und begleiten lokale Friedensprojekte, die sich weltweit für Versöhnung, Gerechtigkeit und Frieden einsetzen. In öffentlichen Veranstaltungen wie der Verleihung des Bremer Friedenspreises machen wir auf diese wichtigen lokalen Arbeiten aufmerksam. Denn wir haben ein gemeinsames Ziel. Wir möchten die Arbeiten für eine friedliche Welt stärken und unseren Teil dazu beitragen.
İşkence mağdurlarına, savaş mağdurlarına,
şiddet mağdurlarına, dinsel ve etnik mağdurlarına.
9 farklı programımızla hizmet vererek dünya barışına katkıda bulunmaya çalışıyoruz.
Sretan vam Međunarodni dan mira. Ja sam Vahidin Romanović.
A ja sam Evludin Rahmanović i zajedno vodimo Centar za izgradnju mira i Sanskog mosta u Bosni i Hercegovini.
Način na koji mi doprinosimo miru je da edukujemo i treniramo ljude kako bi oni mogli zajedničkim snagama graditi pravednije i bolje društvo za sve.
Hallo, wir sind das Team von Gewaltfrei Handeln e.V. hier in Weten, Deutschland.
Unser Ziel ist es, durch Bildungsangebote eine gewaltfreie Konfliktkultur zu fördern.
Wir bilden Fachkräfte für Friedensarbeit aus und organisieren verschiedene Seminare im Themenbereich Konfliktbearbeitung.
Und wir senden viel Mut für Gewaltfreiheit aus in die Welt.
Pozdrav svima, ja sam Zahida iz Bosne i Hercegovine, suradnik volonter organizacije Online Kitchen. Povodom Međunarodnog dana mira želim vam čestitati kao sljedeći da sam veoma sretna da smo u situaciji da možemo pomoći ljudima u pokretu, izbjeglicama, da na granicama njihov život učinimo podnošljivijim i lakšim.
Un saludo a todas y todos. Soy Eva Molina del colectivo de mujeres de Matagalpa, Nicaragua. Nosotras contribuimos a la paz acompañando a mujeres, niñez y juventud en procesos de organización, educación, información, atención para la defensa de sus derechos humanos y el ejercicio de ciudadanía plena.
Čestitamo vam dan mira. Ja sam Ana.
Ja sam Otto Rafaj iz Randa u Hrvatskoj.
Doprinosimo izgradnji mira time što vodimo treninge za nenasilno djelovanje. Učimo transformirati sukobe na nenasilan način. Nenasilje je oružje hrabrih koji umiju poštivati druge i afirmirati sebe.
Dio smo inicijative Vjernici za mir jer smo svjesni odgovornosti kršćana i muslimana za izgradnju mira.
تحية إلى يوم السلام العالمي. اسمي رنا سلمان وأنا من حركة مقاتلون من أجل السلام، وهي حركة مشتركة من الإسرائيليين والفلسطينيين. نساهم في صنع السلام من خلال تجسيد السلام عن طريق العمل المشترك ضد جميع أشكال العنف والمقاومة اللاعنفية المشتركة من أجل إنهاء الاحتلال وتمكين الأفراد لاتخاذ الإجراءات جماعية ومجتمعية ضد واقع يبدو أنه لا يمكن التغلب عليه.
Ja sam Adisa Hotić i predstavljam organizaciju Centar Feniks u Sanskom mostu u Bosni i Hercegovini. Naš doprinos miru jeste poboljšanje kvalitete života svih generacija, posebno djece, žena i starijih osoba. Naročito nam je važna socijalna inkluzija svih članova našeg društva u svrhu izgradnje snažne lokalne zajednice. Mir za nas predstavlja važan put kojim koračamo već punih 26 godina.
Greetings to you from Church and Peace. I'm Lydia Funk and I serve as General Secretary of this European-wide Peace Church network. The stories and powerful examples of nonviolence that we find in the Bible inspire us and challenge us to put these into concrete actions towards a more peaceful, just and sustainable world today.
Tenda haki na huruma, naitwa Teresia Bujiku kutoka Muhora, Tanzania. Muhora tunashiriki kujenga jamii ya amani kupitia huduma ya msaada wa kisheria bure, kufanya suluhu ya migogoro na kufanya mapatano, kutoa elimu kwa jamii na vile vile kushiriki matamasha mbalimbali ya kuzuia ukatili wa kijinsia ndani na nje ya nchi.
Pozdrav, ja sam Neda Popović i dio sam Interocentra iz Hrvatske. Miru se nadam pridonijeti radeći s ljudima u grupama i individualno kako bi se osnažili i odabrali mir, ali i pronašli ga u sebi.
Moje ime je Mihael. Ja doprinosim miru kroz medije. Kroz njih pokušavam osobnim pričama pronositi ljudska prava te inspirirati ljude na prihvaćanje i uključivanje diskriminiranih i marginaliziranih ljudi.
Neka nam ovaj dan bude svima inspiracija.
Antifafa, la journée mondiale pour la paix, meto katan. Franchement, il y a double projet Espérance Afrique, le palime, Guado, le soho, Koudé, Antifafa, le dope bobo.
Tutudo, le Antifafa anti, le Sahel Dome.
Le Fouméome.
Le Hosehaome.
Le Togo du Kome.
Et le Africa du Katame.
Et na dossier katan, là, mieux pour nous, les Didife, nous sommes oji, na soho katan, pour palime du Koblibola.
Jetzt kommt die offizielle Begrüßung.
So now we're going to have the official opening. Lord Mayor, Dr. Bourbon-Schulte. Hello, Dr. Lang. Professor Dr. Birkenbach, who's our main speaker afterwards. Ladies and gentlemen, can you hear me properly? Good afternoon, everybody else, and also those whom we can't see at all, who aren't in the Bremen Town Hall, those of us who are listening online. I've heard that there are partners from Tanzania listening, partners from Bosnia-Herzegovina. I've also heard that from the Coordination Office, Mayors for Peace, people are listening in from the office, so that's wonderful. A very warm welcome to everybody, especially those who are not sitting here in the hall. I'm Annette Klasing. I'm on the board of the foundation Die Schwelle. If anyone wants peace, they have to make peace. We've just heard greetings from our partner organizations. And they were actually the ones who last year in October came along to a discussion here in the very town hall we're in today about peace for the future and how we could call for that more, we who work for it anyway out in society. They're the ones who had the idea and asked here in the town hall, what does Bremen actually do? What does the council do? And we discussed the fact that it would certainly be possible, besides putting up the flag that the mayor mentioned, of meeting here and not just insisting that peace is very important in our age, but also encouraging one another and others to become active. At the moment, as we know, it calls for more arms, more weapons for Ukraine that dominate the scene. Enemy stereotypes are arising. Nobody is calling for them, of course, but they arise automatically through the war. And unfortunately, we are seeing a growth in dislike and this stereotyping of enemies in our own society. So we ourselves, with the many partner organizations you've just seen in the video, would like to encourage you to think about the topic of nonviolence and reconciliation, and also to show ways towards peace, because that's so important and is possible, as we'll hear later in the panel. With Professor Hannah Birkenbach, we've found an excellent speaker, a peace researcher herself. And on top of that, we have 3 representatives of practical work. And one who's working on a real conflict at the moment, Rana Salman from Bethlehem, from the occupied territories. She's a very active champion of peace and justice and freedom, of course. And then Otto Raffay, who works in what we could call a post-war context in Croatia, who will also describe how important it is to constantly talk about peace and non-violence, keep this a lively issue. And then with Mirka Huta, we have a representative of the younger generation who will look at how the young people are willing to work, what they need, what's important for them, and what major activities are happening, particularly on the pattern of climate change, of course. At the same time, she looks to see how this form of commitment can also apply for working for peace and nonviolence. And finally, perhaps you'll be asking, and I've mentioned Rana Salman from the West Bank, but you might be asking why there's no one from Israel. There are very practical reasons for that. Our Israeli friends have asked us to apologize for them. Today is a feast day, and Yom Kippur is the next one. And they've said, could they spare us? I'll mention this again at the end. And we can hear them on the 24th of October, representatives of Competence for Peace, over there at the cathedral. There they have promised they will be available to answer questions about the present situation in Israel and Palestine. So that's enough for now. There'll be other announcements afterwards, and there'll be a short reception as well, where you'll have a chance to converse with each other and enjoy yourself. First of all, I'll hand over to Elizabeth Reiser from Church and Peace, and then we'll go on with the rest of the event. Well, thank you, Annette. I too would like to welcome you here in this beautiful hall and also in the digital space. And I'm really glad that the Foundation Die Schwelle has invited Church and Peace to co-host this. Church and Peace is an ecumenical network of many Christian peace groups and churches, and the foundation is a long-standing member. We're very happy about that. 2 weeks ago, there was a protest demonstration before the parliament in Berlin because of the cutbacks in the budget for next year with respect to humanitarian aid, development aid, crisis prevention, conflict handling, and peace promotion. So cutbacks in a field which is of such imperative importance at this time, where the number of armed conflicts has surged to the highest level since the Second World War. Actually, now of all times, everything should be done to push civilian alternatives. That's what you'd think. But to use the word nonviolence today, or not to think military arms buildup is the answer to everything, is to expose yourself to the claim that you are naive. And that has happened in the last 12 months or even 18 months. It's all the more important that this topic be taken up again and that we plumb the possibilities to see what we can do about promotion of nonviolent strategies. Are they a pipe dream or are they the solution? Having said that, I'm looking forward to learning a lot this evening and hope that all of us can benefit from this session. Thank you. Now I'm very pleased to be able to welcome Mr. Asendorp, who is our moderator. He is quite well known here. He worked for the TAZ newspaper for a long time, and he's worked for the weekly Die Zeit for 20 years, and also for the radio, SWR2, which is a classical radio in southern Germany. So we're delighted that we've been able to recruit you to moderate our session. Thank you very much. Well, thank you. I'm looking forward to it. And I'm particularly pleased to be able to welcome our keynote speaker. Hannah Margaret Birkenbach has been working on peace for about 50 years now at universities of various kinds all over the country, Hamburg, Bielefeld, Berlin, including Bremen, where she stood in for a local professor at some stage. Now she has a chair for peace and conflict research at the University of Gießen. So she's not just an academic, but also privately concerned with peace work. For example, in the working group on peace and conflict research, or many another. And this year, she received the Göttingen Peace Prize for her lifelong commitment. And recently, she published a book called Understanding Peace Logic, which is on the table at the back. It says you don't have peace, you have to make peace. So we're looking forward to your remarks, Hannah. Well, as was said, the information about the rise in spending on arms and the arms trade and the proliferation of military struggles are plain and simple and beyond discussion. And it's on this basis that Dan Smith, the current director of the Stockholm Institute for Peace Research, SIPRI, said a few days ago that we live in one of the most dangerous times since the Second World War. The pressure through the war in Ukraine, the buildup of forces, that is soldiers, the surge in conflicts, the failure of nuclear arms control, and the increasing human and ecological uncertainty mean that the world is confronted with a development in which several crises are overlaid. And Dan Smith concluded that multi-layered problems call for multi-layered solutions. But how is that to happen and work? Multi-layered solutions arise easiest when the relations between states and societies are suited to bring them forth. And that's the case when violence declines. And secondly, the conflicts that block a solution to the problem are worked on constructively, and when social political solutions get involved as well. If such developments emerge, then we can talk about peace development. After about 60 years of systematic peace and conflict research, we know a lot about how we should act if we want to promote such development. In development policy and ecological work, people talk a lot about the footprint, but also about a handprint. Our ecological footprint indicates the extent to which a person or group claims the biological capacity of the planet. The handprint, the new concept in English, gives information about the extent to which people or groups contribute sustainably to the maintenance of the planet, the preservation. I'd like to use this metaphor for us to better understand the 5 principles of action, of which we know that observing these principles will promote peace. So I have a fundamental principle for each finger, and I think it makes it easier to note. The thumb, preventing violence. Solving entangled crises or multi-layered crises increases, they become easier to resolve when you can prevent them in the first place, when new cycles of violence are precluded and avoided, and when resources are invested to stop them. That's always necessary. Here, it's a matter of doing this as early as possible. It's a matter, for example, of disarmament and arms control, and also of reconciliation, stopping talking about enemies, and the ability to delete hate messages from the communication repertoire. The thumb has an extraordinary position, though. If there's a lack of effort, then it's very difficult for the other four principles to apply, that is, the four fingers. So for this reason, the postulate of active nonviolence is of the essence. The second finger, that's the index finger, which points, conflict transformation. Multi-layered problem solutions are more possible if the conflict is understood before, during, and after escalation and tackled accordingly. Changing the conflict constellation is necessary so that conflict parties can work on interim solutions, and those are those which are better than the unbroken continuation of previous practice. And that only works if the capacities of the actors to serve as partners grows. They trust each other and want to work together on the same and joint task, even if they don't get on. They have the same goal. That's the point. The fact that the confrontative relations between Russia and Ukraine, as between Russia and the West, are not very cooperative, that is obvious, and it's hard to imagine that it could be. But that's always the case with violent conflict, because our imagination is simply restricted. However, once a peace process has got underway, then it seems fairly plausible what had to happen to achieve it. And that's why we know what we have to do now. The third finger, that is the middle finger, which I've called a dialogue compatibility. Multi-layered solutions can only come about when you communicate in such a way that it's compatible with dialogue. Only this way do spaces for thinking and cooperation arise in which agreements can be reached to reduce violence and to take up the blocks and remove them, to get them out of the way for progress. In the UN Charter, such an approach is called peaceful settlement of conflicts. If through mediation or negotiations it's to be possible for the war of Russia against Ukraine to be concluded, then the actors have to remain in dialogue, directly or via others, if they want to stabilize this idea that coming to peace, if they want to change anything. It was easy for neutral Austria, and of course, Austria has always been neutral, and it has provided a place for the UN, which has a whole lot of groups and units. There are 20, in fact, and about 5,000 staff members. And it's certainly true that Russia should be interested in these. It's very active in the UN. And on top of that, there are a whole lot of NGOs who have special legal status, all this in Vienna. And ultimately, that's a place where new ways of thinking and cooperation arise. Now, as I've said, you need a great deal of imagination to imagine there could be that kind of security guarantee for Ukraine too. But there's nothing wrong with being creative or imaginative if you want peace. Now I come to the fourth finger, the ring finger. Developing norm-oriented interests, they are necessary so that the obligation to keep to global norms also applies when conflicting interests powerfully oppose them. Anyone seeking multi-layered solutions will have no better choice than to pick up the major interests which could be legitimate, recognized as such, and to set them in a peace-promoting course. Bremen has experience with the peace-promoting conversion of the arms industry. If I see correctly, however, such conversion, even in Bremen, has not succeeded, at least in a lasting way, unfortunately. So even for that reason, then we need the small finger, the little finger. The principle of error friendliness, the little finger does quite a good job there. It's necessary to learn from failure and flops and to see how peace logical action can be more successful and sustainable. We ought to expect that governments would use this knowledge from peace and conflict research in order to find ways out of the polycrisis that even they know about. In fact, however, we have to fear that they will develop in the other direction and react by investing more in the arms dynamic, probably increasing the conflict. We also have to fear that the material and cultural capacities for problem solution will decline and that public discourse or political discourse will get rougher. The peace initiatives present here today are trying to constitute a counterweight, a counterbalancing force, and to work for more peace and nonviolence, of course, but they are only some of few. You all know that each of your influences is only minimal, perhaps capillary, but it's the point of getting together. The emphasis is on education and training with people who want to acquire peace competence, practice and expand it. The French philosopher Edgar Morin calls this pensée complex. In English, it's called complex thinking. In German, it's called thinking gymnastics. Where are the people and their representatives to learn today how they can make a peace policy handprint if they don't get together with initiatives in, with, and via such initiatives, which with their small resources can come up with a big project that is promoting the culture of peace. Just as is the case with the footprint, each of us can do very little to save the planet with our ecological footprint, but the whole point is for so many others to do it with us. And the same could apply with peace. So what can such initiatives achieve who have been brought together today by the Foundation Die Schwelle as partners? I'd like to indicate 6 factors. Such initiatives can, first, maintain peace policy discourse when hardly anybody wants to know anything about peace, because public opinion has become a resource in order to maintain the military fighting morale. Secondly, such initiatives are important and useful because participants in events like this learn how to articulate and tackle their own concerns up close. And that makes cooperation and coexistence in everyday life at least more tolerable. Thirdly, a third effect is that through everyday related practice, our skills to discern a crisis behavior grow quite beyond our immediate proximity, our immediate environment. And we can learn to resist the phases of, or phrases rather, which promote violence. Participants who have worked with peace workers will get involved in project work in civil society peace organizations much more, by the way, than in rather rigid political parties. That's a problem with democracy because they rely on political parties. But I hope that the parties can learn from the peace logic. Fourthly, we can assume that it makes a difference when we have taken part in projects for active nonviolence and have practiced pensée complex, complex thinking. Fifthly, this initiative can be very good for early warnings because they have access to neglected and socially depressed milieus where violence unfortunately often arises because no other form of action or behavior is known. And political actors take no notice of what goes on in such milieus far from the cities. Sixthly, it was French Christians who worked towards détente between France and Germany a long time before the politicians came up with a treaty. The reason was that they met them very often and more was not possible at the very beginning. That was a lot. And coming to Britain, for 20 years, we can say the Friday Agreement 20 years ago was based on another 20 years of civil society dialogue-oriented peace work by churches in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, Britain, and many other countries who supported that. And it was 2 women and a journalist who set the whole ball rolling. Then the Good Friday Agreement came to being. I can see 3 conditions for such wide-ranging effects. First, the proliferation of such initiatives. Secondly, the connection between different initiatives, linking them into cooperative networks. And thirdly, opening the eyes of political actors to new forms of cooperation. Despite their unequal experience of, or incomparable experience of suffering, oppression, and power, competence for peace, here represented by Rana Salman and the others, the dialogical principle is useful for coming closer to a solution in a conflict situation that you can't get out of. This approach needs more political resonance. It's only through supra-level cooperation that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons came into being in 2017. Now, I don't know whether the International Network of Mayors for Peace was involved in that, but I do know that this network is growing in Germany and that some of the members have more or less publicly started applying for or advocating for the Federal Republic of Germany to accede to the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. I'd like to know to what extent it's possible for the older mayors to get together with the younger activists of Peace for Future in order to work together in plugging for security policy that does justice to international standards. Perhaps we'll hear more from Dr. Boven-Schulte, the mayor, and from Mirka Hutter, who represents Rethinking Security, the young person. I was impressed when a couple of weeks ago I went around with Anna and Otto Raffael in Croatia. Their organization now offers training courses for local politicians, and this offer is apparently taken up. German organizations could do that too, German local authorities. So I will conclude with these ideas about multi-layered ways out of the violent polycrisis we're in at the moment and hand over to those who know much better than I do what can still be done if you keep this handprint in mind. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Hannah Birkenbach. Now, before we open the panel, stay there, please. There are a couple of questions. Could you take a microphone? One concept remains in my mind, that of doing away with the idea of enemies, one word in German. How does that work? It's very concept, it's very unusual. De-enemizing. How does that work? To stop talking about enemy stereotypes. Could you explain what you mean by that? And who are you appealing to? Individuals or the whole of society? Could you hold the mic up? Thanks. It's to do with relations between 2+ people, a plurality of people. It's all about relationships. You could start with yourself. We used to talk about overcoming enemy stereotypes that we have and preached that others should do that. But here it's about putting relationships on another basis. We distinguish between the enemy and the opponent. Using language sensitively is part of it, but de-enemizing people is a greater concept. It's a matter of changing attitudes to people. I only learned this recently. In Franco-German relations, the beginning of friendship after the war amongst Catholic Christians, it was most impressive to hear how they learned how to pray with each other. They could only put up with each other for the prayer at the time. They had different motives. As far as I understand, there was a French priest who launched this idea to practice the Christian peace ethics, but the Germans who participated they were interned in France as prisoners of war, and they wanted to get others out. They had their ulterior motive, if you like, and that's fair enough. The fact is, to just sit down together and pray, doing something together, is a good step towards being less of an enemy. There's been a lot of insecurity, uncertainty in the peace scene since the 24th of February 22. A lot of peace groups didn't know what they could still do. Of course, they know really, but putting it into practice is so difficult. And you talked about thinking gymnastics in German, complex thinking. Or can't we pick up the point? It's always been the case in the past. Just doing what the peace movement has always done. I think it's probably based on new ideas, though, isn't it? Well, I don't think that the peace movement has ever rested on its laurels. You always need new ideas. And having peace gymnastics means changing, of course, and it implies responding to the new situation and engaging in nonviolent communication. That was used very early. Other people just wrote appeals, but the groups knew that they had to do more. And of course, at the moment, there's a lot of discussion about it with the war as a backdrop. And I must say, I don't feel uncertain or insecure here. I think this description of peace groups is made by those who are not familiar with the peace movement, haven't been so active. They have read about it in the paper and then say, oh, they must be very insecure. But if you've worked in the peace movement like myself, I wouldn't underline that or subscribe to that attitude. Well, of course, there is a certain element of despair, in a sense, when we look at the situation at the moment. And the question is, how can we change it? And of course, the task is immeasurable. And there's disappointment, of course. The more democratic people think or are, the greater the disappointment. Well, we can't go into full discussion on that right now. We've got the practitioners in a minute in the panel. So now I'm going to ask Mirka Huta and Otto Rafai to come up. Mirka has launched a movement called Peace for Future in Berlin. And Otto, and we saw him on the video, belongs to RAND, which is the regional address for nonviolent action. And the third person, I'll stay up here, will be Rana from Bethlehem. We'll see her in a minute. She was on the video too. She's the manager of the Competence for Peace organization, which was founded by Israeli soldiers and Palestinian fighters who renounced violence. And Competence for Peace was the name they chose for themselves in seeking a solution for the conflict. As you've heard, She's speaking in the middle of a very tense situation. Okay, then you have the floor. Over to you.
To me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me tonight. It's a pleasure to be among you today, even virtually. I know the most frequent question that is perhaps on the minds of many of you is whether Palestinians and Israelis can actually work together for peace in the midst of an active conflict. Well, I'm here to say that the answer is yes, it's possible. Human beings are made of all kinds of emotions. We can be hateful, hostile, frightened, and aggressive. We can also be understanding, welcoming, and compassionate. Societies are the same. They can behave in very different ways. It's all a question of which values get to be emphasized and how the more disturbing aspects and feelings get processed. Do we bury them inside or do we address them head on? Combatants for Peace is an alternative community, a joint binational community. Our movement seeks to change the political situation through 4 domains of work: direct action and work on the ground to provide support to Palestinian communities impacted by violence stemming from the occupation, international awareness and advocacy, building community beyond borders, and education and empowerment of the next generation of nonviolent activists. Combatants for Peace aims to serve as a model. We embody in the present the future that we desire to actualize and bring about. In a sense, we create a new culture, a joint culture, one that recognizes the power dynamics and injustice of the occupation, but still chooses one another despite all odds. A culture that emphasizes mutual understanding, respect, compassion, and the humanity and lived experiences of one another. I'll just give a brief description of who we are as a movement. Combatants for Peace was founded in 2005 by Palestinians and Israelis who had taken an active part in the violence and now work together to break it, to bring an end to Israeli occupation and build a safe and free future for all. We are the only movement worldwide that was founded by former fighters on both sides of an active conflict. We are committed to nonviolence, and we use civil resistance and creative activism to challenge and transform systematic oppression. Our movement consists of many international activists. Together, we work towards a mutually agreed upon solution that will allow Israelis and Palestinians to live in freedom, security, and dignity in their homeland. We do not seek to deny our violent past, but rather work with it, process it, turn it from a site of conflict into bases for joint constructive action. This is how we perceive the history of this land and of the 2 people who co-inhabit it. We envision a future of liberty and dignity for both sides. We work through various means, including joint protests and direct actions on the grounds, tours in the occupied territories, which expose Israelis to the realities of the occupation in the West Bank, in-house workshops, empowering young Israelis and Palestinians through our educational programs, lobbying, and media outreach. We are also involved in assisting villagers and other Palestinian residents who experience injustice as a result of the occupation. Finally, we hold powerful, high-profile public events, most notably the Israeli-Palestinian Memorial Day ceremony, which offers an alternative to the violence and dehumanization of the other by encouraging mourning over all victims on both sides. The event, which began as a fringe ceremony in Tel Aviv in 2006, now draws thousands of people and is watched by hundreds of thousands worldwide. Most recently, we launched a joint Nakba remembrance ceremony to encourage Israelis, Palestinians, and international audiences to remember and understand the radical events of 1948 while facilitating reconciliation and collective transformation. As Palestinians and Israelis, we believe that reconciliation, freedom, and equality for both people involve a sincere and honest confrontation of the past. The two ceremonies aim to liberate us from the mental cage of the current situation. We are locked in, imprisoned in a drawn-out limbo of oppression and violence, which seems to have always been here and will never end. We aim to present this reality of bereavement and disposition not as an act of fate, but as a result of human choices. Seeing these choices for what they are and then choosing differently will allow us to break out of the present and build an alternative. This year, our main theme of both ceremonies was recognition. We see recognition primarily as knowing or coming to acknowledge what had already been known, but was suppressed, denied, or muted. We interpret recognition as the confirmation of each other's humanity and of every human being's right for security, dignity, and freedom. By recognition, we mean looking out of the window at our neighbors and looking in the mirror at ourselves with compassion. This is what we were, this is what we have done. If we recognize that, we can do better. The impact of the movement's activity is recognized by thousands of news items worldwide, special reports, a critically acclaimed documentary, and multiple prizes, including the International Bremen Peace Award in 2007. Nonviolence is a central principle of Combatants for Peace movement. Most of our founders and members came to nonviolence after having been active perpetrators of the cycle of violence. They were allowed through many nonviolent activism trainings to deepen their understanding of nonviolence and strategize nonviolence tactics and methods to assist in our movement opposing the occupation. Some of our movement's past nonviolent strategic action campaigns have included a months-long sit-in and solidarity tent that protected the village of Khan al-Ahmar from demolition, a water campaign that raised awareness and challenged unjust water policies, staging mock graves outside of religious Zionist offices in Jerusalem, and a campaign fighting for Palestinians to have access to a road that was taken from them and given to Israeli settlers. As a joint movement, we face so many political challenges, especially right now with the most right-wing government in Israel's history. In addition to military incursions deepening into the West Bank and the increase of settler attacks against Palestinians. This year has witnessed an escalation of violence like never before. January 2023 was the deadliest month in 7 years for Palestinians in the occupied West Bank. And for Israelis, they experienced one of the worst terror attacks in decades, as 7 Israelis were shot and killed outside an East Jerusalem synagogue on Shabbat. We realize it can be so difficult to stay committed to peace when every day another person is killed in the region, or a house is demolished, or a land is confiscated, or a family member gets imprisoned. But we also realize that in today's political reality, action is essential in order to create real and lasting change. I'm deeply proud of the role our movement is playing in the fight for democracy today in Israel. Over 100,000 Israelis have taken to the streets to protest Netanyahu's government's radical plans to destroy the independence of Israel's Supreme Court and judicial system. Our activists never seem to get tired and continue to persevere. They are present in the protest every week, holding the Palestinian flag among a sea of Israeli flags to make a statement. It is not done to provoke, but to remind the protesters that they can't simply call for democracy for Israelis while Israel's government maintains a military occupation over 2.7 million people who lack basic and fundamental rights. Protesters shouldn't be surprised that a judicial overhaul is planned, further reducing civil liberties and politicizing the appointment of lawmakers. They shouldn't be outraged if corruption is excused without consequence and incitement is encouraged. None of this is shocking when you consider that occupation not only exists, but is widely accepted as a way of life. We need to broaden the discourse to reflect reality, because human rights for some, but not others, is simply not democratic at all. Another challenge that we face as a movement is the social attitudes and perceptions. For example, Palestinians being accused of normalization in their society, and our Israeli activists being accused as traitors or siding with the other. As a movement, we lead the way in showing the world that Israelis and Palestinians can be more than allies, and that joint work is a powerful tool against many obstacles that block our path to peace, peace that is rooted in justice and equity. We grew up as neighbors, but we were separated by walls of hatred and division. Yet we stood united by our shared struggle against separation, and our struggle for the future of this land. Peace is a process, and it requires significant commitment. Thank you for having me tonight.
Ja, vielen Dank, Rana Salman.
Well, thank you, Rana. We've heard how difficult it is to engage in peace work inside a conflict. Now, from Otta Rafai, we can hear whether it's easier or harder to do peace work after a conflict. He's from Croatia. The war in Kosovo and in that area concluded a Croatian correction in 95, but its roots are still relevant today. So the question is what that means for peace work in such a country. Yes, I come from Croatia, you're right. 30 years ago, there was still a war in 93. And my work started that I didn't want to go to the reserve police. I went to the police station in the town where I lived. I said, is there an alternative? And there was no conscientious objection. Actually, the war hadn't broken out at the time. And they said, that's all right, you can go. But then the war broke out. We as a family fled to Switzerland and Germany to escape it for a while. And in Germany, I got to know Pax Christi, the Catholic peace movement. And this organization, at least the members I met, were willing to receive people who didn't want to fight. So we stayed in Germany with this support for a while. And our first encounter with the peace issue and peace theology took place then, because both my wife and I have studied theology, and we took part in training courses here in 1994 and 95. And as I told someone today in a conversation, I did literacy work in peace in German. That is, I spoke German at the time as I heard about the peace movement. And that led to a decision to do more for our society, our post-war society in Croatia and the region. And so that's why we do what we do. After training in Germany as shalom ministers or peace ministers, 95, we were able to offer training again to others in cooperation with others. In Croatia, a lot of such organizations were founded. There was an anti-war coalition or a peace center in the east of Croatia. There were people who were willing to look for an alternative way forward. And they decided to found a peace organization. So the full name of RAND is an Organization for Peace and Nonviolence. So there's nothing very new, but we're tied up in the context of our region. I don't like the word difficult. I don't use it. we have obstacles on the way. The question is how we can hop over them or get round them or even through them so that we can continue to give witness to our own values. That has become my calling, finding places where people can encounter one another. And that's the essence, that different people are willing to meet each other. So that's our inspiration, as it were, to get people together who come from hostile groups who are willing, after the war, to come together. The first courses were back in 97, in October. They were 12 days long. It was quite a challenge for a lot of people. They were afraid to meet each other. Some came from a different city, and they'd been driven out of the city where they were. And how were they going to encounter these people, different inhabitants of the area? So that can be very challenging, that type of encounter. Our training courses are based on encounter and get to talk and overcome prejudices, if you like, and learn to talk better, to express themselves better, and to express appreciation as well. And again, nonviolence has been our main topic. Attitude and action are the two pillars of our policy, personally and politically. I bear witness to this when I speak in public every time. And the question is, how can the participants learn to express themselves better? And the second activity that Anna and I are engaged in is Believers for Peace. Now, that started in 2003 during the second Iraq War. We saw that in our region, there were radical forms of public statements and approaches to different people. Negative remarks about Muslims, for example. Some spoke of a great jihad, or some said that George W. Bush, who used the phrase crusade against Islam. And this led to a heightening of opinions, and that's where Believers for Peace came about then in 2006. Now, we're a group of people, Christians, Jews, Muslims, Orthodox, Catholic, mainly amongst the Christians, and we want to show how we believers in God draw on the source of peace and make peace accordingly. At this time, we wanted to take peacemaking responsibility. So we've had many conferences since then, since 2006. And the point is that our motto is, by building peace, we praise God. In other words, we see making peace as an act of piety, an act of spirituality. It's not just sitting there on our knees, praying, singing, but doing something, rolling up our sleeves to help people in society and encouraging them to work for peace. And the third pillar, this was mentioned by Professor Birkenbach, for the last 2 or 3 years, we've tried to approach politicians at the local level, members of town councils, who bear responsibility for their city. We did some research, on how these politicians use the word nonviolence in politics. And at one meeting, a former candidate as mayor of Rijeka said, I've come to this meeting because it's an oxymoron, it's a paradox. A nonviolent politician, it doesn't exist. I prefer to use the plural, politicians. So the sustaining power of a nonviolent approach can be adopted by politicians. This is the challenge. So now we've heard from Rana and Otto. What it's like to live in nations, either with acute peace problems at the moment or in the recent past. In some ways, it might be easier to work when the conflict is there rather than afterwards. In Germany, we have the problem of living in peace. But peace work goes on. It's not just during, but also before and afterwards. Now we're going to ask Mirka Hurter how she sees that. What work do you do? Well, basically, I'm interested in what we all understand by peace. For me, peace isn't just the absence of war, it's a lot more. Peace means our relationships with each other, personally, socially, and of course, politically. But peace starts a lot earlier, not just when violence occurs. It's a matter of developing constructive relationships, and a world without conflicts is not realistic. It's a matter of how we deal with them. That's the point. And then peace can mean that, for example, with a topic that we have at the moment, respect for nature can be included, or serving justice, ensuring others can enjoy justice. Peace and dealing with conflicts can mean a great deal. If we can spell it out in these situations, then just about everything is piecework. And when a war comes, of course, then you need constants to fall back on. It's constant work every day, because it's not just a stable situation. You have to keep working at it. So that's where Peace for Future comes in. I'm representing that project, which arose under the heading of Rethinking Security, which is a collection of now 150 peace organizations in Germany that is working for civil and peace-logical security policy, that is civil, stressing civil as against military. And we want to achieve civil security by 2040. This was written down in 2013 when it was launched, and a scenario was drawn up. Of course, with the Ukraine war, things have suffered a setback. Since 2020, my colleague Teresa Hirn and I asked myself how young people can get particularly involved in rethinking security. And that's where the project Peace for Future was developed, by analogy with Fridays for Future. So we've had that for just about 2 years now. So young people generally are very interested in peace. It's not the case they're not at all, but it's just simply they feel powerless. The climate crisis, the COVID pandemic, and now the war, all of this is very debilitating. And I think young people are submerged in a collective depression. They feel powerless when they look at the future. So the question is, can they contribute at all? can they play a constructive part? This is where Peace for Future starts. We give them some hope, at least we tried, to give them some future prospects that make sense. So imagine we would live in a world where there was a constructive handling of conflict, and this peace capacity was lived out by everywhere. That would be a world in which people mutually understood and supported one another, despite discrepancies and conflicts, despite skin color, any other features of their humanity. We try to treat people responsibly and as equals, and have a policy which is open to the future and is fit for the future. How could we work and live with our families and friends in such a world? In what kind of society would we live, and what sort of policy would it have? It would be different from now, of course. And so with this future vision of a really peace-oriented world, we go forward. That's our basis. And there are two main elements. One is peace education. We run seminars. We train peace mentors, and we're setting up a network as well. That's the second thing. Our target group is young people from 17 to about 30 with all kinds of backgrounds. And it's very important to us that people with such backgrounds can get into networks and attend. Peace mentoring is what we want to train them for. And that's a 3.5-day in-person training course, and then with online sessions. I've just said they had a very broad view of peace, and that's important. The first thing to do is look at what peace means. And it can be spelled out in different dimensions. And on this basis of the diversity of peace, we then organize our training courses. So we have 3 levels. First, the personal level. We look at how conflicts arise, how we handle them, and how we can deal with them constructively in a very practical way. So we practice nonviolent communication. We do role plays and have a look at how it works or how things don't work, different responses. Secondly, there's the social level, where we learn how having the courage of our convictions works. If I experience discrimination or violence, how should I react? And then we have a role play about different forms of action. This will work, this won't work. What can I entrust myself to do? And there's so much division in society. The question is how we can overcome it. Regarding COVID, the war, these are issues that we discuss. They're often very heated discussions and very exhausting. So it's important to see how we can make these sessions where the young people come together constructive. That leads us to the third level, the political one, where we look at how we could have a more peace-directed approach, what our attitudes to war, and particularly the war in Ukraine, and importantly, the difference between peace and security thinking and logic. There's plenty of that in Germany, security logic, and how can we use that at the 3 levels? And what does it mean, not just politically, but also socially and personally for me? And we assume that everybody is involved in this need for peace. One important aspect of our training is experiencing agency. So there's a lot of practical exercise here. And it's possible to run a project that starts during the training. The project development and implementation is accompanied through coaching afterwards. And afterwards, of course, we stay in contact with people. It's quite important that we have online networking sessions once a month. We discuss topics and continue to educate one another. And it's very important that we can get involved in joint projects and mutually support one another or go to demonstrations together. Our training is very hands-on, very practical. And you don't have to be academic, you don't have to know anything really, just be interested. And it's very important that we have practical and bodily elements, also games, because these topics are so serious and difficult that we try to have fun at least in the training. That works quite well. Usually the people are changed when they go home, they're transformed. After 3.5 days, they always feel it's been like a week because the period is so full of experience. There's a group that doesn't know each other at the beginning. At the end, they're closely linked. Sometimes I feel they don't even want to leave the room, and they're very grateful. And that's wonderful. So that's why we go to different cities with our courses. For example, Münster, Rüsselsheim, Lüneburg, these are planned in the next few months. And that's why it's important to get more and more people interested in peace and getting active. At the moment, we're well integrated in the peace movement. We cooperate with local organizations and other coordination projects. At the same time, we're concerned to reach people going beyond the peace movement. That works very well with our training. We have people who've studied peace research, some have not. Some have migration histories, many have not. My doctor was there, then other people I know, and it was very diverse. And we want to enhance that diversity too. As I've said, the networking or the interconnections between the different levels has to be pointed out. That peace isn't the absence of war, but everybody can contribute to a peaceful society and a peaceful world. Thank you. So, Hannah Birkenbach, you've heard 3 case studies, 3 practical examples, and you explained the 6 factors that were effective. Do you think these 3 proponents are doing it properly? You'll probably say yes, but still, there might be something more. I think they're all brilliant. When I hear groups like you, I learn so much about what works. These points that I quoted were, of course, a kind of distillation of experience. We know what works and what doesn't work in research. But there are 2 major difficulties that I see for all these groups. That is finance. It's funny when you talk about peace that you're not allowed to talk about money. Well, you're obviously not talking about money, but nothing works without money. And I think it's wonderful that you now have staggered contributions for people. In other words, some pay more, some pay less. With events abroad, we have the problem of how governments in other countries can be encouraged to be supportive. It's not just governments, but look at the other countries. There are people who are millionaires. They've got far more money than they need. The question is, how can contact be created to those who could provide the wherewithal, who have a good, who are well off, as it were. And I would say there's a lot of self-exploitation involved in voluntary work. The people work very hard with very little money. And it's sad, in such a rich country like Germany, to have to go around with a begging bowl for every project, say, could you give 1,000 or give something? It's all nothing, really. It's cheap anyway. Call a spade a spade. That's one point. And secondly, it's all connected with the fact that these initiatives have to be integrated into the democratic process of the Federal Republic. How can that be done? That question has not been solved, even theoretically. And researchers like myself and practitioners have to think hard about what we can do. In my youth, this was called the extra parliamentary opposition. So you're remaining outside of governmental structures. But I don't think it should stay like that. It'd be better to integrate more into democracy so that young people can experience that they are undergoing a lot of changes, not just in their personal lives, but other things can be changed. Why do Germans have to say we don't want a speed limit, for example, at least some of them, and block the others? Can't certain things be changed in society where we get the feeling we're making progress? If I were a young person again, I'd start fighting on that. Well, I've got a question now to our practitioners. We are living in a time where a lot of money is spent for arms, hundreds of billions. Germany has given 100 billion to Ukraine and is rearming its own army. Do you think more money would help the peace movement? Yes, I think so. We have a lot of creative young people who studied peace and conflict research. They're looking for jobs. They want to work in that field, but they can only do it in a voluntary capacity. They're well trained, they have energy, but then they take other jobs because they've got to earn their keep, they've got to earn their living. And then they don't have time for what they actually studied, peace work. So if there were more jobs available, that would make a difference. I can add something. Of course, more money is always useful, naturally. But really, it's the attitude that needs to change. When security is threatened, then the familiar methods are resorted to. But the peace movement is not homogeneous. When there are wars, and people say, where are the peacemakers and not the generals? They always make more war by throwing in more weapons. The whole attitude needs to change. After the Second World War, no war was conceivable. The countries all said, we're defending, we're not attacking. But even the Russians say attacking Ukraine is defense. The Americans said it's defense when they attacked Iraq. And that is a concept, defense. We're not attacking anyone. We're not allowed to after the Second World War. But this is disingenuous. So how can this strategy be replaced by other strategies, a strategy of confidence or trust? In Croatia, the Serbian Croatian war parties went to negotiations, but when they went home, they didn't do what they'd promised. It's a bit like saying you're not going to use petrol, but then you deal with it on the black market or something like that. So we have to change this logic of thinking and see security differently and trust dialogue and in interpersonal relations. That's the direction to invest in. And look at one airplane, one fighter jet can cost 100 million, apparently. I mean, these are incredible dimensions. Well, Hannah Birkenbach, I'd like to ask about reconciliation. If we look to the future and hope there's a time when the acute conflict is no longer there, it's still in people that they could be conflictual. And if you look at Ukraine, the question is always what has to happen now? But sometime the war will happen, the war will end, and what will happen then? How can they go into neighborly relations?
So what we actually do is that we are trying to build a community. We do, for example, regional groups. For example, activists from Jerusalem and Bethlehem, they meet together once a month. We're trying to build this community. For example, if we wake up tomorrow and there's no occupation anymore, there's no separation, will there be still a community? Will we still be connected in a way? That's what we're trying to build. We're not only co-resisting together, but we're also trying to build this joint community. It's more than coexistence because we're both working together to end the Israeli occupation and to end any form of violence against the people who live here on both sides. So will the war end afterwards? Will there be any other conflicts when the occupation is over? Maybe. We're human beings, and this is part of what we do. Humans create war, and not somebody else. But it's our commitment to remain struggling for non-violence methods to become part of our life and part of our method of living and our principle in doing everything, not just in resisting any forms of violence, but also in a way as we live. We take it as part of our life.
Mirka Hotter, wenn man das jetzt in Deutschland überlegt, was würde das in Deutschland im Moment?
So what would that mean if we transferred that to Germany? How can we prepare for the time when the war in Ukraine is over? And there's been a lot before. You had a German-Russian exchange, there were cultural exchanges. It's all been swept away. Almost all. So the question is, what remains of these connections and what would have to happen so that they could be revived? Well, I can't tell you everything that exists, but what we can do is different things. I think a lot of us have internalized the enemy stereotype of Russia, and it would be important to get away from that and to create our own connections. We have enough conflicts in Germany where it's possible every day to exercise peace logic. I find it difficult in my own life, but it's daily practice. And the more people do it at the societal level or can join organizations that do it constantly, then we could try and reach out to people in the countries where we're involved in the political conflict and just see that we lay the foundations for after the war. Are you shaking your head? What do you think we should do? Well, I can't list all the connections, but we have groups of Ukrainians and Russian women where they try to encounter one another. There are different initiatives along those lines. there are initiatives by Germans who've come from Russia. They're called Russian Germans. And they live here, but they've got contact to their families back in Russia. Ethnic Germans, sometimes called. But nobody knows about that. And these things are not made public generally because these groups have got the attitude that they're nervous, not of criticism as such, but of verbal attacks. And it's become difficult to express different opinions in public at the moment. It's just difficult to discuss them. But a lot does happen. And there are projects that are even being supported by the Foreign Office, but they don't let you know. You're not supposed to know. And there's a lot where we academics are in a difficult position frequently because we have no information. For many years now, I've been trying to find out what do mayors for peace actually do? What do you do? You can't just wear this name. You must talk about something or do something. And there may be good reasons for that, but it all takes place behind closed doors. It'd be good if we could find out more. At the moment, you only find things out in informal discussions. And I, as a researcher, have got involved in diplomatic processes, and you learn a great deal there about how to pick up signs and interpret them in reality. But I think there's a lot more diplomatic and political initiatives that are running than we know about. And so it's difficult to know where to support it as such if we really don't know about it. But I can well imagine our host, the mayor of Bremen, knows a lot more about this. Well, you can ask him afterwards when we go to the reception. Before we close, a final question to our guests who aren't from this city, and they tried peaceful conversion of spending on weapons after the Berlin Wall, and it didn't work apparently, but nobody is prepared to tell us why it failed. In other words, weapons are still being produced. Let me wrap up by asking you three what we can do better here in Bremen. Otto knows it very often, very well. Well, make it quite clear that violence is not necessarily and non-violence exists. There are so many people in the world who we don't know, who work for peace and non-violence. The world would be a much worse place without them. I think it's the awareness that non-violence exists and that you can work for it. That's the key to making peace. And that has to continue, even though the situation all around is quite difficult. I agree. Don't give up. Of course not. I think that applies to everybody, regardless of where they work. And I'd like to come back to the point that peace has to be shaped. It's not a situation that we're going to reach just like that. It has to be brought about. It's an experience. It's an active action. and everybody can get involved in this creative process. What I always find in our training in Peace for Future is that the people's eyes are opened and they say, oh, I've got so many options to make peace every day. And that realization is very encouraging. And what do you suggest?
I think it's important also in Germany and other parts of the world to shine light on these amazing initiatives around the world, people who work for peace. Because usually what we see on the news, people focus on the war and all the bad news. Nobody talks about those kind of peace work, especially, for example, for us in Palestine and Israel. You can barely hear about Palestinians and Israelis working together against oppression. So it's very important that you also take this to your media, make pressure onto your government to also make changes over in this region, and especially also in Ukraine and in other places, to make pressure on our politicians to take action and make a change, not only just to make statements, but to really take an act. And I would also take this opportunity to also invite you to meet our Competence for Peace when they come to Germany in October. If you will have a chance also to meet them and hear from our activists who work in the field and hear about their experiences. They are better present the situation here than I do. And I would also invite you to come to the region and visit and see by your eyes like what is happening, because when you see the actual facts on the ground, it's different when you go back and become like ambassadors to this region and like share the news with the others and spread the message for peace like among your networks.
Ja, wir sind am Schluss
Well,
unserer
thanks
Zeit.
very much. Now, this is the end of our time. Thank you, Rana Salman. Thank you, Hanna Birkenbach. Thank you, Otto Rafai. And thank you, Mirka Hutter. I now hand back to our host here and say thank you again. Well, of course, I too would like to say thank you. Everybody concerned, the mayor and the moderator and the guests, and everybody who made this event possible. Rana and the others. It's been said several times, are we too quiet? Are we too shy? Have we been shaken too much and made insecure in the last few months? But peace is the only way forward. This is our message. This has to come out clearly and loudly. That is something that I've understood this evening, even more than before. And we will continue to follow that course in our foundation with our partners. Now, Rana has rightly said, attend on the 24th of October when we hear from our friends from Israel and Palestine in the chapter of the cathedral. And a week before, there's another event, which is also interesting, with representatives of the Central African Republic. Probably can't imagine that there aren't just people who live there, but also institutions who tread the paths of peace. And they have founded a peace university and peace institutes. 3 of these peace friends from Central African Republic will be there on the 16th of October at 7 o'clock at night in the cathedral chapter. And they will report about this African country. So you're warmly invited to that. The leaflets are out on the table anyway. And finally, back to money. Hannah Birkenbach said money is important. I'm very grateful for that. Everybody knows that funding is necessary. Otherwise, we can't do anything. Without donations, without advertising, even we in our foundation have to hold out our hand. We are an organization that grants money, of course, but we have to have an income in the first place. So anyone who'd like to join is very welcome, or make a donation. Use the opportunity to donate. It'll be possible as you go out. And symbolically, I'd like to thank our guests here on the panel. Rana will get her present another time. And her friends, when they come in October, will be able to take it back to her. Once again, thank you.
Wir danken noch der Übersetzerin Lydia. Keiner hat hier Lydia gesehen.
We thank Lydia for translating into German.